'Cause you delight in showing mercy. Mercy triumphs over judgment. You delight in showing mercy.
Philip is a true gentleman. I think he is just a master ceremony of all master ceremonies. Well, before we begin, I realize that there are some people here today who were not here yesterday, and of course we can't go over it all again, but basically we covered some features of the Shroud, and now we're going to pick it up in the 20th century, all right? And I'm very keen on time. I plan on wrapping this up well ahead of time in terms of getting done 1:30ish and having time for questions. Am I too loud?
No, no, no.
Just up a little bit, huh? Okay.
What you need.
Okay. Today, like I say, we're going to be covering the 20th century, some modern research, what's currently happening, and finish up with some closing comments. And 2 points to keep in mind. Okay, number one, the direction that we're heading on this. The purpose is the Shroud is a sacramental, like holy water, or a blessed item. All right, it's a sacramental which points to Jesus and the Blessed Sacrament, and then by deepening our relationship to Christ, we become more saintly, to become saints, all right? So the purpose of this is to help us to become saints, all right? And then the second point is that it's going to involve faith and reason. And there's a harmony between faith and reason. This is science with a Catholic flavor, all right? And there's a harmony. Our faith and our reason go together, and they never conflict because they both point us toward the truth. And therefore, they both point us toward Christ. And we should never apologize for either of those. And so we begin with the 20th century. In 1978, enter the Shroud of Turin Research Project. Dr. John Jackson, who's that gentleman right there, he leads a team of 24 scientists from the United States. Over there they are unloading 80 crates of their scientific equipment. And for an unprecedented 5 days, from October 8th till October 13th, 1978, these scientists spent over 120 consecutive hours studying the Shroud, all right? And this is the most comprehensive overview of the Shroud ever done in history, and remains so to this day. And they put it through a very severe battery of tests. They use all kinds of microscopes, infrared spectrometry, X-ray fluorescence, thermography, ultraviolet fluorescence, extensive photographic data. The entire electromagnetic spectrum is run across that Shroud. And then for the next 3 years, they study their data. And they publish in over 24 different scientific professional journals around the world, their articles. And after looking at all this data for 3 years, getting feedback from their scientists, they are ready to publish a summary paper, right? And in 1981, this is a snippet of what their summary was. There are no paints, no pigments or dyes found on the fibrils. It is not the work of an artist. Now, they made this claim 35 years ago, and it still holds today. There are no chemical or physical methods which can account for the totality of the image. All right? 1983. All right? This is King Bertrand II. He was the last of the Savoys. As I told you yesterday, the Savoys were in power in Europe from the 10th century up into the 20th century. And he was the king of Italy. And for his marriage, for his wedding in 1931, the Shroud was brought out and put on display. And it was brought out on display in 1933 for the 1900th anniversary of the Resurrection. It was brought out in 1978 for the 400th anniversary of the birth of St. John Bosco, who was Turin's great saint. And it was brought out again in 1998 for the year of Jesus Christ. If you remember John Paul II, in 97, was the Holy Spirit, and then Jesus Christ, and God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit. And so it was been shown 4 times last century. Well, in 1983, King Umberto II, who had been in exile in Portugal since Mussolini came to power in 1939, Italy lost their king, all right? And so King Umberto, he dies. What's going to happen to the Shroud? Yeah, you're fine. Your comrade put it up, and you got it down. I'll leave it there. Well, in his will, he had willed the Shroud to the seat of the Holy See, which means whoever is the acting pope at that time, they will be in possession of the shroud. And so now, for the first time since St. Peter himself, the shroud is in possession of the successor of Peter, beginning in 1983. And here we see a picture of St. John Paul the Great with Dr. Jackson, his wife, Rebecca, and son there. Okay, 1988, all right, and we're speaking April of 1988, a handful of scientists, a few Europeans, and 3 professors from Oxford decide they want to do a carbon dating test on the shroud. And long story short, the Americans were excluded from this. The list of people who were supposed to be involved was whittled down from 7 laboratories to 3. And I want to show you the area they took it from. Everyone can see the face there. You can see the arm, see the blood stains on the arm. There's a water. Now we're down here by the right foot, right in that corner. Can you see where the laser's at? That area is very dark, is it not? That is not from the fire. See, these are scorch marks from the fire. The entire edge here was not touched by the fire. So why is that edge so dark? It was where the shroud was held by hands for centuries. It was the most contaminated area. There are actually 2 contaminated areas on the corners where the shroud was always held. And that's why those pieces are missing. After centuries of being held, they're gone, all right? And we're going to enlarge that here now. So you see this area, and we're going to enlarge this again, all right? Now this is about the size of a 3x5 card. Everybody knows how big that is. Okay, now this right here is the Holland backing. That was the backside that was sewn on by the nuns in 1534, all right? And then this area here is not very large. It's only about 8 centimeters long. And they were going to cut some pieces. These samples for the carbon dating test are about the size of your fingernail, about the size of a postage stamp, okay, less than 1 square inch. This first piece here was given to Tucson, Arizona. This next one was given to Zurich, Switzerland. And then a piece was cut out for Oxford in England. And then they decided, you know, that Arizona piece is a little bit small, and we're going to give Arizona another little sliver. So Arizona got a second piece there, right? This piece here was retained and remained in Turin and was later studied, and by looking at this piece, they could tell what was on these pieces because they're adjacent to each other. And this piece here is cut out in 1973, Dr. Gilbert Ray's, and by examining that fragment, they could tell the composition of these as well, okay? Now this is the carbon dating lab in Oxford, and this was the very apparatus that the sample was placed into. Underneath that glass plate there are 50 holes. They're labeled 0 through 49. And the sample is placed inside there. It's analyzed. It's basically destroyed as the sample is torn apart, and they can get a ratio of carbon-14 atoms to carbon-12 atoms, and that ratio should give them some indication of age. We're not going to get too technical here, but a long story short, in order for radiocarbon dating results to be reliable, the sample must be pure. It can't be mixed with something else from a different era because that's going to throw the years off. And the sample must not be contaminated because if there's other extraneous carbon on it, that's going to make it appear younger than it really is. And in case of the shroud, both of those cases were violated, all right? But nonetheless, in October of 1988, 3 Oxford professors, Ed Hall, Michael Tite, and Robert Hodges, they announced in a press conference that the shroud dated from the year 1325 plus or minus 65 years. And that's why you see this 130-year gap there, okay? So what should we do? You know, yesterday we covered, there was all this data from forensics and biology and botany and geology and archaeology and history that was all consistent with authenticity on this side of the scale. See, there's a fulcrum on the scale. And over there is the lone test from 1988, which says it's from the 14th century. Should we throw all of this data away in favor of that? Or should we try and understand what is the reason for that discrepancy? So scientists said about this process, right? And I think what you're going to see in the next few slides is something you may not have seen before, okay? This is the chemist Ray Rogers in a famous picture taken in 1978. And he was given some samples to examine that were adjacent to where those samples were taken, actually touching them. And he made a most remarkable find. You know, I told you that the shroud was made of linen, pure linen. To this day, Jews bury the dead in pure linen, all right? Well, he discovered in that sample area cotton, okay? Cotton mixed with linen, all right? And I'll show you exactly where this is at. This darkened area, here's where the cotton begins, and there's where it ends. Here's where the linen begins and ends there. And in this area where I'm waving the light over, that is a splice. And there was a common skill at that time, which is not common in our day, known as invisible weaving. And that when you wanted to repair royal garments back then, you would do the best job you can to restore them. These days, we would just throw it away and buy something new. But there was a guild of very skilled tailors, 13 of them in France at that time, that could do this invisible weaving so that when you got done sewing it, you couldn't see the seam, all right? But there's cotton in this area, or it could have been cotton from the nuns who sewed the patches on in the 16th century. In any event, the chemist Ray Rogers was able to find this cotton, and he published his paper January 20th, 2005, in the most prestigious chemistry scientific journal in Europe called Thermochemica Acta. And I just want to quote what he said, or two sentences. Okay, Ray Rogers, he was a very good chemist. The radiocarbon sample was not part of the original Shroud of Turin. The radiocarbon date was thus not valid for determining the age of the shroud. End quote. All right, now 6 weeks later he died. And other scientists, if it's valid, it should be able to be confirmed. Dr. Robert Villarreal of Los Alamos National Laboratories in New Mexico, he studied these samples. He too found the cotton as well as gum arabic, and they've also found some red silk and some blue threads in there as well. And so other scientists confirmed Ray Rogers' work, all right? So, a word about carbon dating. First off, it's not infallible, all right? When the Pope preaches on faith and morals, that's infallible. But we are not infallible, and carbon dating is not infallible. I'll give you a sample of some results that carbon dating has given here. About 20% of all carbon-14 dates are cast out because they usually compare it with a control sample. And if the results are just so far off, the chi-square value is off the charts, it's deemed invalid. Okay, significant deviation is what we call that, all right? So this happens very frequently, right? Secondly, for example, here's some other samples. A freshly killed seal that used the carbon test not found to be 1,300 years old. Is that so? Could a seal be that old? Leaves, deciduous trees. Leaves last, less than a year in that tree and fall. Fresh falling leaves shown to be 400 years old. These are examples of carbon-14 results that have been discarded, okay? A snail found to be 26,000 years. I'm not sure how that would taste after you kill that. All right? But there's other evidence for contamination besides this finding of cotton that was that the chemist Ray Rogers claimed. Dr. Bill Meekum of the University of Hong Kong, who was a world-respected person working with carbon dating, he says the general perspective of field archaeologists and geologists view contamination as an incredibly complex problem because, one, you don't know how much contamination is on the sample to begin with, which might affect the results. Two, if you try to clean it, how can you be certain that you've gotten all of it? All right, so contamination is just something that makes carbon dating less than perfect. It'll give you ratios of carbon-12 to 14, but it doesn't necessarily give you true ages, okay? Now, another area of contamination would happen here. If you can see that, for you people in the back, that's kind of small. So the shroud, as I told you yesterday, was held up by bishops many, many times over the centuries, right? Look at the way he's gripping that corner. I've seen many pictures. Some of these pictures, they show 6 inches of the shroud corner, hanging out the top of his finger. If you notice, both those corners are missing on the shroud. The shroud's corners were handled countless times over the centuries, and every public display added further contamination to the corners. And later on, after examining this data, they said, the sample site that they chose was the worst possible location that could have been chosen. And that's a whole other story, but we're going to keep moving here. Enhanced contamination. Well, so far we got contamination from holding it. We've got contamination from perhaps a reweaving job of cotton. But there are other areas where the carbon may have been thrown off. Okay, the fire of 1532, all right, which put all those holes in it, could have added carbon-14 to the shroud. Carbon and carbon-14 are part of the combustion process, all right? If carbon monoxide levels today are just 2% more than they were back then, this would make the sample appear to be 1,400 years younger than it really is, all right? And that statement has been published by Dr. John Jackson, all right? So you can take your pick there. There's a lot of areas. It was likely a combination of these contamination perspectives that resulted in that. All right. Something else is that there's something besides carbon-14 that could determine the age of something. All right. There are 3 other more modern tests, more recent tests. 2 of them are chemical, and one of them is more of a mechanical one. And all 3 of these tests were done on the Shroud. Look at the date on this. In the year 2015, less than a year ago, actually, Dr. Giulio Fonte and Pier Andrea Malfi of Italy published a book, The Shroud of Turin, First Century After Christ. And they ran these 3 tests on shroud samples, and all 3 of these modern dating techniques put the shroud in at the year 33 BC, plus or minus 250 years. Now, I realize that that's a wide range, but I'm going to show you on a chart how that gets narrowed down, okay? So stay with me. And by the way, they had a 95% statistical confidence level, which was much better than the 1988 test, which chi-square value was off the charts, less than 1%. Okay, one of these tests is called the Fourier transmission infrared, all right? And it basically uses infrared light, and the reflectivity gives an indication of its age. It's not so affected by contamination. The second one is used with a laser, does a similar thing. The third one here, in which you take a control sample, and the way they pull apart with the strength comparatively will show you a relative age, and there's a wide range there. But now what I'm going to show you next is if you put all of these things on a chart, it makes much more sense. And across the bottom of our table, we're going to have time, right? Time is going to go across the bottom. Here we go. There's the years before Christ, 1,000 years before Christ. There's the first century AD, and there's the year 1500. Now there's the FTIR test, putting it in that range of history. There's the Raman spectroscopy, and there's the tensile strength. All of them are pretty wide range. But if you overlap them, here we go, they all overlap in the first century, and only the first century. So while these 3 tests have a wide range, they are pretty consistent with the first century. All right? All right, now we believe that after you compare all the evidence we talked about yesterday and a little bit of the evidence I've just covered here, people can make their own reasoned judgment regarding the authenticity of the shroud. For example, we have the blood stains on the wrists, the feet, the side, the cap of thorns, the blood analysis of forensic, the blood from a man who's lost a lot of blood, the blood on the shroud from a man who's died. All of that consistent with the Gospels and confirmed by forensics. We have the travertine argonite. This was dirt on the shroud, which is found in Jerusalem, right? On the nose, the knees, and the soles of the feet, confirmed by archaeology. We have the pollen grains from Jerusalem and Constantinople, confirmed by botany. We have all that historical evidence I spoke of the other day. The Pantocrator icon from the year 550, the Tremesis coin of 692, the Sudarium of Oviedo from the 7th century, the Precode manuscript from 1192, and all those other things we spoke about, confirmed through history. And then that last little box there, these more 3 recent modern dating techniques that all place it in the first century. So on the left side of the scale here, you have all this scientific evidence, and on the right-hand side, you have the 1988 carbon test, which was recently described. And we believe that people can look at that and make their own reasoned judgment regarding the question, is the shroud authentic or not? 1997, another fire strikes the shroud. On Good Friday, April 11th, 1997, a fire breaks out at the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist. This is in Turin. And the shroud surely would have been destroyed because, you see, it was normally kept right here above the altar. And by the way, the fire itself was a mystery. They never did determine exactly what was the cause, but just a few weeks prior to the fire, the shroud had been removed from this altar and placed over about 15 yards down the side of the church, encased in a marble encasement in the wall with bulletproof glass around it to protect it while they were going to be putting some scaffolding here to work on the ceiling. Right? So that's what really saved the shroud. It didn't get burned up in the fire. So how did the shroud get out of the cathedral? Super Mario. This is Mario Trematore. He was the fireman on duty that night, Good Friday night, who had the presence of mind to grab an 8-pound sledgehammer and begin pounding away at that bulletproof glass. Now, the shroud is inside that casket right there. It's rolled up like a poster, okay? And you and I have not had the experience of pounding against a bulletproof glass, but let's put it this way. If a bullet can't get through it, it's not easy for you to get through it either. And it took him quite a bit of time, and after midnight, He is able to get a hole through there and get the hole big enough to get the casket out. And now on Holy Saturday morning, all right, April 12th, 1997, just after midnight, the shroud is carried out of the cathedral. It was examined and looked at in a nearby church room and found to be that it was not damaged. But for the next year, the shroud's whereabouts were kept secret because they were concerned someone was trying to destroy the shroud.
Yes.
Okay. The next event in the shroud's history was the year 2002. Can you see the difference? All right. Once again, 4 European scientists, without consulting the American scientists or those that had worked on the shroud before, they were concerned that the shroud was somehow coming into disrepair and they needed to do something to preserve it. And so, long story short here, they took off the patches. Can you see them? These are just holes now. They took off the old Holland backing there. Remember the nuns sewed that on? And they put on a new Holland backing, which, by the way, was manufactured in 1950. And then they cut these areas that you see patch, burn mark, patch. Now it's just hole, hole. All right? So these are not patches, these are holes. And then they vacuumed it. And in vacuuming it, a lot of evidence was taken from that. And so this resulted with some well-justified criticism from the scientific community for 2 reasons. Number one, there was not a broad consultation undertaken beforehand to decide if this was necessary and was this the way to do it. And secondly, in vacuuming the shroud, a lot of archaeological evidence was lost, right? But this is what the shroud looks like today. Okay? It was then placed in an aluminum reliquary, and this is what it's in today. It is no longer folded up or rolled. And when they put it on there, it actually stretched the shroud out about 3 inches. Perhaps it loosened the fibers, whatever. The shroud is 14 feet 6 inches now, and about 2 inches wider, about 3 feet 9. And they sucked all the oxygen and nitrogen out of it, the air, and they put in an inert gas called argon. And argon does not react with anything. So therefore, the shroud is kept from any atmospheric condition changes, and it controlled humidity and temperature as well. Okay, and it was put on display recently. Perhaps many of you have heard of this. I talked to 2 people here that visited it when it was on display here this last spring. All right, there was day 1. That was a picture posted on Facebook of the shroud on display in Turin, and just before the end of the exposition, on June 22nd, 2015, Pope Francis himself had a private audience with the shroud. And I had to get special permission from L'Osservatore Romano, the Roman newspaper, to get these pictures. So these next pictures you may not have seen before. There is Pope Francis with the shroud. He looks rather animated. And there's the corners, of course, where the shroud was always held. And those are the corners that are missing from the treatment over the years. And today, that aluminum reliquary rests in a marble sarcophagus with a drape over it. And if you look in the very center here, you see some sliding glass doors. It's behind bulletproof glass there. So people can get, within several feet of it, but they can't actually see it, of course, until the next public display. And that will be decided by the Holy See, whoever the Pope is decides. So Pope Francis is full of surprises that might happen in the next decade. When Pope Benedict showed this in 2010, it was declared that the shroud would be seen again in 2025. And boom, Francis comes in, and it comes out in 2015. So we don't know when the shroud will be displayed again. Okay? Current research. This is a copy from the most recent international scientific conference on the shroud, taking place in October 2014. And I had the privilege of attending this, and I was able to, over a 4-day period, I was able to see every single scientific paper presented. There were 42 of them, from scientists all over the world: France, Italy, Spain, Germany, the UK, the United States. And of those 42 presentations, only one scientific paper even challenged the authenticity of the shroud. The overwhelming majority of scientists have moved on to now to try and answer these 2 questions. How was the image formed? and some historical gaps, okay? So that's the focus of research today. Now, in looking at image formation, I spoke about this yesterday. There are 17 traits unique about the shroud, and any hypothesis that attempts to explain how the image was formed has to consistently match up with those 17 traits, all right? Otherwise, it's an invalid hypothesis, all right? And you'll be able to, this is put on a truth table where the hypotheses and 17 traits are all on a nice table. This is on shroudofturin.com. You can download it and get your document. My PowerPoint is not on there, but everything I base my PowerPoint is in this document. So there are actually more pictures in here than there was in this PowerPoint, all right? And you can have this for free. Go to shroudofturin.com. I'll hit that again here. Now, some of those traits that make a shroud unique. Superficiality, all right? There have been 6 artist hypotheses that have been published in scientific literature, okay? And all 6 of them fail the superficiality test, all right, that I covered yesterday. That's just the uppermost microscopic fibers of these tiny threads, all right? There's no pigment or paint. There's no cementation in there. There's no stuff of the image, all right? It produces a reverse negative. It produces a 3D image with a VP8 image analyzer, which I spoke of yesterday. There's blood and serum. This means the blood that exuded from that body was from a person who had been dead at least a half an hour, but less than 8 hours. The blood had separated already. So it's not just blood that's splotched on there where the serum is mixed with the blood. They are separated. And you can see this with ultraviolet light. You'll see the blood stain, then you see this halo delta around it of the serum, okay? There's no side images, right? It's vertically aligned. And this last one is very significant, okay? There's no image underneath the blood. Now, that indicates a sequence. And in all the artist attempts to make the shroud, because the blood stains are so anatomically correct, you would have to make the image first, whether you're using some red dirt and rubbing it in, or some type of pigment, and you would get the image made, and then you would put blood in the appropriate spots, right? In that case, your pigment, right, would be underneath the image, and the blood would be on top, because your image came first, and then your blood would be on top. Are you with me? Okay, that's a sequence of image first, blood later. That's what an artist would do. But the shroud doesn't show that. There's no image under the blood, which means the blood came first. Good Friday. The image came second. Easter Sunday. And it was so faint, it could not penetrate through the blood. And we've confirmed this with x-rays. So this feature really points out a consistency with the Gospels and between faith and reason. So how did the image form? Well, about 30 years ago, Dr. Jackson first proposed this hypothesis. It's called the fall-through hypothesis. And 30 years later, this hypothesis still stands up to scrutiny in terms of explaining those 17 traits, all right? And here's how it goes. The image formation could have been formed by a burst of light, and as the body became mechanically transparent, the cloth would have collapsed through the body in the plane of gravity, because if the body all of a sudden disappears, the top of the cloth falls toward the center of the earth, all right? And everything is going to be vertically aligned as we see it on the shroud. And that gets us back to this, what we saw here. Now I need to say a little bit more about that, but there is the long strip to keep the linen on the body. There is the shroud, and there was the head cloth carried from the crucifixion site to the tomb and then taken off on Good Friday while the body was wrapped. Now, so what's this, how did this body, how did this collapse through the body? Well, Dr. Jackson explains this as if the body became mechanically transparent. That means it was no longer bound by the rules of nature, all right? For example, if you think about Easter night, the night of Easter, which is in actually today's gospel reading is touched on, the apostles are afraid. They're locked in the upper room. Jesus has been crucified. Who's next, right? All right? And then all of a sudden, Jesus comes among them. How did he get through that door? How did he get through that wall? His body was mechanically transparent, all right? It was a resurrected body. He was no longer bound by the laws of physics and nature. If we accept that Christ saw the apostles, we have to accept that his body was mechanically transparent, all right? Now the question is, when did that moment begin? If that moment began at the instant of the resurrection, then a burst of light coming from that body could have formed the image that we see on the shroud in a very superficial way. Okay? Now, we can't state with certainty that the image is formed that way, because that's why we call it a hypothesis, all right? Because no one witnessed the resurrection, and that is a gift for our faith. If the resurrection had been videotaped and everybody believed, where would our faith be, huh? But it does mean that the faulty hypothesis has the highest probability of explaining the image, right? It's also acknowledged by the Shroud Science Group that the mechanism for image formation might never be explained, right? Okay, the other area of research is on history. That gap from the sack of Constantinople until the display in 1355, that 150-year period is an area of great research, as well as earlier centuries, but we're finding more things in this time period than we are from, say, the earlier centuries. Okay? If you want to see more details, you go to shroudofturin.com, and just 2 clicks, you'll see it. You can't miss it. Download the critical summary. That takes a couple minutes, and then you can keep it on your desktop and view it at your own convenience whenever you wish. All right? A couple closing comments. We're on the home stretch here. I invite you to read this on your own. He's saying science is limited to the physical world, and faith helps us to understand the supernatural realities. Okay? So what does the shroud tell us? Jesus' passion was real. That's real blood on the shroud. Jesus' death was real. This was blood from a dead man. And his resurrection is real. A couple of ideas of how, okay, now that I know this about the shroud, what do I do with it? How does this help me grow spiritually? There might be 600 reasons in here of what you could do, 600 ideas. I'm just going to buzz through a few of them here. Obviously, to contemplate how much God loves us. It can strengthen our faith in the resurrection. Help us prepare for communion. The reality of the shroud points to the reality of the Blessed Sacrament, as well as our thanksgiving, which we make afterwards. Right? To inspire deeper meditation on the Passion. And when we pray our rosary, you know, those sorrowful mysteries and those glorious mysteries might take on a little more intensity for us if we consider the shroud, or perhaps if we had a picture of the shroud while we do these. 2 more. Okay, the shroud can inspire us to strive to the highest degree in the way we live our lives. You know, Jesus lived his life fully as an example for us. He could have redeemed mankind with a paper cut. And that would have been more than we needed, because he's infinite divine. But that would have been minimalism. Minimalism, common in our culture and your culture, is where and we all are succumb to it sometimes, where what's the least I can do to get by, huh? What's the least I can do? Christ could have done that least, but no, he chose to do the most. And that's an example for us, to strive to the highest degree. And I compliment the organizers of this, who are living examples of striving to the highest degree. The shroud can inspire us to do small things with great love. You know, the little treads the little way. Jesus did a great thing with great love. We only have to do small things with great love, because God doesn't judge the greatness of the act, but the love which prompts it. There was an artist in Italy, Veronica Piercini. She gave a presentation at the Shroud Convention. She put some flesh tones on the shroud, and for her, the shroud helps her to see God. You know, for others, it might be, think about your cell phone. You know, you got some wallpaper on your cell phone. Perhaps it's a family member, a loved one. What if you put the shroud on as your wallpaper for your computer? And every time you looked at that cell phone, you're practicing the presence of Christ. That's another thing you could do. Okay? Final remarks here. We made it. It's only 1:33, and we'll be done here in just a minute, so we'll have time for questions, all right? This is Bishop Michael Sheridan of the Diocese of Colorado Springs, who founded the Fraternity of the Shroud. I have some brochures on the confraternity. If any of you are interested in seriously considering joining, I'll put them on the ledge over there afterwards. You're welcome to grab one. Bishop Sheridan said this: faith is about more than probability. The martyrs did not die because they thought that Christ was probably the Savior of the human race. They died in the certainty that he is. That's one of the things I love about our Catholic faith. We enjoy a certainty. We enjoy a certainty about things, and you can't put that into words, but it's a greater certainty than, 2 + 3 is 5. Yeah. God exists as a Trinity. I'm more certain of that than I am of 2 + 3 is 5. All right? Back to Bishop Sheridan. The difference between life and death is absolute, and to be so sure of something as to pay for it with one's own death is to be very sure indeed. Our faith rests on the reality of the resurrection and not on the authenticity of the shroud, but if it is authentic, then it is the most precious relic in the universe. This is Caravaggio's Doubting Thomas, right? And you'll read about that in the gospel here, right? The shroud is a sacramental, sacred signs which lead us to the sacraments and sanctify our lives by the divine grace flowing from the paschal mystery of the passion, death, and resurrection. Christ said to Thomas, "You believe me because you have seen, Thomas, but blessed are those who have not seen and believe." That's us. We haven't seen, and we believe. What a comforting word from Christ, huh? So perhaps our response should be like that of St. Thomas. My Lord and my God. And I acknowledge my thanks to Dr. John Jackson and Rob Siefker, who put together this critical summary over many decades, and all the work they put into that. And my thanks to Barry Schwartz, who is the Jewish photographer from the 1978 Stirp team, who lives near Colorado Springs, by the way, spent the summer visiting a day this summer. He given me permission to use all of his photographs, right? And I have, in case some of you can't remember that website, shroudofturin.com, I have an email here as well. I've got a few of these cards here. If you want to see me, I can hand a couple of those out as well. Okay? I will gladly entertain some questions. Wow, we got 10 minutes here. We're in good shape. Yes, ma'am.
The Veronica's veil, has it ever been tested?
Yes, Veronica's veil is also known as the Montepello, right, the image of Montepello. And the image of Montepello is stored in Montepello, Italy. It supposedly was made when Christ was walking his way to the cross. The eyes are open. It is on a very extremely rare type of fabric that you can see through, which is actually made out of a mollusk, and you can't paint it. And yet here is this painted image. And so the image formation itself is a mystery, and it is venerated by the faithful in Montepello, Italy. And there have been some scientific papers where they've compared that face to the shroud, and the majority of papers are in concurrence that there appears to be a consistency, but I can't tell you for certain that the veil at Montepello is Veronica's veil, but a great many faithful believe it is. He'll bring the microphone to you, ma'am. I normally walk around with a wireless, but that would create chaos for the cameraman, so I'm going to stay up here. I'd like to be out there amongst you. But.
Pollen grains. You've mentioned them several times, but the significance of pollen grains, that the sequence that you talked of was actually proven by pollen grains being extracted from the fabric. So could you comment on that, please? Yeah.
Sorry, what's your question about the pollen then, ma'am?
The question is it significant that the pollen grains, are they significant?
Well, on a scale from 1 to 10, there are other features about the shroud that would rank above that one, but the fact that it comes from that area is something that a European artist could not have duplicated, because pollen grains are extremely minute. When you see a little yellow dust thing on a pollen, you're seeing hundreds, perhaps thousands of pollen grains, and the microscope wasn't invented until the 17th century. So no medieval artist could have foreseen, I'm going to get some pollen grains from Jerusalem and stick them out here to make it authentic. It's significant enough to show us that the shroud was in Jerusalem, and the shroud was in Constantinople, and that is consistent with the history we have on it. So it's supportive, but it's not definitive. This gentleman up here has a question. He's bringing the mic there.
The 3 scientists from Oxford that did the carbon testing, what's their opinion on this today?
Yeah, what's their opinion on the shroud? One of them is dead. Michael Tide has died. I haven't heard of the other 2 passing away yet. But of course, they were convinced that the carbon date finish things for all time. I will give you a website here that's got the full story. Give me just a second here. These are things you didn't see that go in a much longer thing. There she is. Professor Emanuela Marinelli. She is from Spain. She's a professor, and she's written a 30-page paper on what happened before, during, and after this carbon testing. Who said what? Who were the driving forces behind that? And there are three names that will jump out at you. And she published this paper in 2012, The Setting for the Radiocarbon Dating of the Shroud. All right, and it's on a website, very easy to find. Just go to shroud.com. That's Barry Schwartz's site. And search Marinelli, and you can see her paper, and you'll see the driving forces behind. Michael Tite was probably one of the major forces to ensure that the carbon dating test was carried out that way. I don't want to speculate on his motives or what he thinks of it now. I can only say that he was one of the movers and shakers in making that test happen. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, I think I can get her.
The soldarium, the face cloth of Jesus, has that been put through as much scrutiny as the Shroud of Turin?
Yeah. Her question is, the Sudarium of Oviedo, the head cloth found wrapped in its place by itself that we covered yesterday, that hasn't been put through the extreme battery of tests. They haven't had, 24 scientists going at it for 120 hours. But there's been a lot of research and research papers on it to determine that the blood types match and the blood stains match between that, and the antiquity of the cloth, pollen grains, things like that. But they didn't use the entire electromagnetic spectrum in studying that. But it's been studied very significantly, and there's nothing to indicate that it's not authentic. Okay? It doesn't prove it, but there's nothing that conflicts. Okay? You guys are having great questions. Back there, oh, yes. You look like a junior high teacher. You could probably do it without the mic.
I have listened to another talk on the shroud in the past, and there was a suggestion from the speaker that the shroud may have been used as the linen cloth for the Last Supper, and I'm wondering if you could comment on that.
Yes. Her comment regarded, there's a hypothesis that the shroud itself, which is 2 cubits by 8 cubits, could have been used as the tablecloth for the Last Supper. Okay. Dr. Jackson has been working on this for about 30 years, and he is still actively pursuing this as a possible hypothesis that could be true. And there's several reasons. When you look at the actual shroud, you can see stains here and there that appear in like 12 or 13 places if someone was dragging hyssop or spilling their wine. The fact that you could never use a burial cloth for a tablecloth in the Passover, but you could use the tablecloth in the Passover on a body afterwards, all right? And so I talked to him about that very question, talked to Dr. Jackson, and his wife is Jewish, has a master's degree in some history, and they both feel that that is a valid possibility, and they're still pursuing that. And this website that I told you, shroudofturin.com, is updated a couple times a year. So 2 or 3 or 5 years from now, when they publish their paper on this, you can see it on that website. And for the rest of your life, you've got a go-to source that's going to have current factual information, all right? That's why I really try to let people, if you just go to Google and hit in Shroud, you're going to get a mixed bag. You're going to get some things from journalists that may or may not be scientifically sound. You're going to get some blogs that will repeat misinformation in cycles. You get that kind of thing. And so that's why I really direct people to these two sites, shroudofturin.com and shroud.com. I think that's the most reliable source. So to answer your question, ma'am, could the shroud have been part of the tablecloth? The answer is it's an open question. But if you think about that, that means it saw the whole Triduum. It saw Holy Thursday, the institution of the Eucharist. It saw the crucifixion of the body, and it would have seen the resurrection, which we celebrated on Holy Saturday. So it could be a relic of the Triduum. Okay? Last question. Well, I'm just running you ragged there, Bill. Oh, I think it was somebody fanning themselves.
Last one?
Okay.
I have have a question regarding the veil of Veronica, because there is one veil that's said to be in Rome and the other one is in Monopello. So which is the correct one? Because the veil in the one that was I have a
I
question.
apologize. I'm sorry, ma'am.
I have a question regarding the veil of Veronica.
Veil of Veronica.
Yeah, because there was this one that was the one in Rome, and wherein Jesus was have eyes closed, which was the one in the picture of Saint Therese of Lisieux, and then the other one was the one in Monopello. So then there's also some things that says the one in the Monopello is the correct one, while the one in Rome is not the authentic one?
Yes. She's talking about there are two possible veils, right? And actually there are several. Throughout history, from about the 15th century to the 18th century, there were several. And obviously they can't all be authentic. And many of the other ones have been discarded. But the majority of opinion on studying these is that the veil of Monopello is if it is authentic, that is the one. And these other ones would have been copies because they're painted. They have pigmentation on them. Only the veil of Monopello, to my understanding, has an image that is mysteriously formed. Kind of like, this is a mysterious image, you know. It's different from the shroud. There's no superficiality about this. This one goes all the way through. You ever wonder what's on the back of the shroud, or back of the artilla? Our Lady looking off to her left shoulder. Here she is looking off to her right shoulder. It goes all the way through. One final comment for the good of the order, and then I will yield to our beautiful singers here. Philip asked me if I could share some good news with you about Catholic education in the United States. There are many bright lights across our country. We have many very faithful bishops. There are some 200 of them. And in my particular diocese, the Catholic high school I teach at, we have daily Mass available for the students before school begins. We have confessions available before and after school every day. Every class begins and ends with prayer. We have extensive speakers and special assemblies on teachings of the faith, on marriage and the family, the dignity of marriage. We have a very active pro-life club, and it is Catholicism on steroids. And I'm very privileged to be a part of that and teach in that environment, because I had to teach in the public schools for 32 years. I hope, Philip, that suffices. It's just a very brief overview that you know, we can sometimes get down on, yeah, I know it's rough around us, but let us never lose sight of the reality that this is a temporary thing that we're going through now, and the victory's been won. And from the perspective of eternity, we'll look back and go, you know, I probably worried too much, all right? God love you all. Thank you.